I'm here with Dr. Nathan Eckstrand, visiting assistant professor of philosophy, Fort Hays State University, who is an expert on the concept of revolution. And I'm very excited, but can we start with something small? Can you just help me get political terms on the table? Some people say, politically speaking, the state. What exactly is that?
The state has meant many different things over the course of political thought, and what the state means can vary depending on what person you're reading. In general, we talk about the state as a political order of some sort. That could mean that the people are in control, which is, what happens in a democracy. It could mean that one person is in control, such as a dictatorship or a monarchy. It could mean that a few people are in control, such as in an oligarchy or a republic of some sort. But you have to have some clue about how decisions are going to be made and who is going to be deciding what topics to take up. And that's actually part of the state too, is what things should a leader decide? Should leaders decide about policy only, or should they decide about everything, controlling all aspects of a person's life, including just very basic things like how much exercise they should get and nutritional needs? You have some people in our society who say that the government should be small and only decide a very few number of things. Those are called libertarians. Not the only ones who believe that, but that's one school of thought that says really keep the government small, have it do as little as possible, and really give people the freedom to make decisions themselves. Or there's some people who will argue that the government, controlled by a few people, should be making decisions for everyone. And that can be sort of a totalitarian society. Or you can have people saying that we should have a larger government. It should be making decisions for issues that affect many different people. But you should have these decisions be made democratically. And that tends to be more of the socialist or communist way of thinking about things.
You gave us a lot of examples of different states, but I think you started using the word or concept state interchangeably with government. Is
Mhm.
that right? So are those synonymous?
Not necessarily, but they're often used synonymously. So again, to go back to my first statement, a state is just a political order of some
Mhm.
sort. And pretty much every state has a government in it, and they're often the ones making decisions. But it is possible to have a state with multiple different parts. To just give one example, the US, of course, has a constitution with an executive branch, a judicial branch, a legislative branch, and that's part of our political order. There's also state and local governments. There are police forces and so on. State can refer to all of that, and because all of that's really part of how we organize our society politically. State could also refer to different parts of the economic sector, which of course would be separate from the government. That said, the government is a vital part of the state, and it is, I would say, the most common term that we use back and forth when talking about states is government. But we shouldn't conflate the two or sync them up entirely.
Excellent. So they're not perfectly synonymous, and sometimes the government is a part of a state. Sometimes state means something other than the government.
Mhm.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for clarifying that for me. So, making a transition from state as a concept to revolution as a concept, can you tell me, historically speaking, what have we historically or traditionally thought of when it comes to the concept of a revolution?
Mhm. There have been, again, several ideas, but I'll start with the theory that's probably most common, which is social contract theory. And I'll explain that term in just a second. social contract theory starts with people like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, who say that there is a contract among members of society at the heart of our state. And this contract is what is termed the social contract, that before there was a contract, there was a state of nature. People had, well, they describe the state of nature in different ways, but people basically lived by themselves. Now, some people think this state actually did exist. Other people say it did not exist, but they say it's a concept that helps us to understand society. In the state of nature, people describe things in different ways. Thomas Hobbes very famously calls the state of nature nasty, brutish, and short. It's a very violent place no one wanted to live in, and people will leap at the chance to form a contract with others and have some sort of order in their lives. Locke actually compares the state of nature at one point to the Native Americans. And we now know that that was a racist thing to say, that the Native American culture much more elaborate, complex than Locke was hearing, but he thought the state of nature actually did exist at some point in the world. He thought it had happened in Europe in the past and was happening when he was writing in North America. And when we form the social contract, certain things come into play. The contract will state we will give up some of the things we have in the state of nature and we will get back other things. Locke says we keep our rights, which he says are life, liberty, and property, but we give up our right to enforce our rights. In the state of nature, if someone is attacking me or trying to steal my property, I have the right to go after them and attack them back, protect my property, protect my life. I give that up in the state of nature. In society. Excuse me, my phone's ringing. Okay. Sorry for the interruption. We give that up in the state and then afterwards, and that time government really is what's controlling it. Now, when it comes to revolution, we have the state of nature of the society that's formed. What comes after that is that we have people in charge. It could be one person, which is what Hobbes says. It could be a couple people, the type of government Locke prefers. It could be everyone. Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher, talks about that. And we give these people power and they can misuse that power. When they misuse that power, they are breaking their side of the contract. They are not doing what they said they would do. And so the people have a right to get power back for themselves. And that's exactly what John Locke says in his theory of revolution, that if a leader breaks their part of the contract, then our concept of revolution is that we have a right to get rid of that leader and put in a new leader. We have the right, because the contract is being broken, people are misusing their authority, either because they are neglecting their responsibilities, or, as people will often claim when justifying revolution, people are taking too much authority for themselves. And so that's the most common concept of revolution. There are some others, but I'm going to stop for a moment just in case you have more questions.
Excellent. So thanks for explaining John Locke and Thomas Hobbes' social contract theory in very broad and easy to understand terms. I think that that's a good way to explain what has been traditionally thought. And I want to get to the more interesting stuff, which is what you think. You've got a unique account of what the concept of revolution is really all about. Do you think this is a good moment for me to ask you to explain your concept?
I can get into it now. My concept of revolution is, well, let me back up for a second, explain the problem that I see with that other theory of revolution, which I also argue applies to all theories of revolution, in the book that's forthcoming that I wrote. In the social contract tradition, you can get rid of bad leaders, but you cannot use revolution to create any sort of state. Revolution is a powerful tool. It is something that can and should be used to help improve society. But that's really not what social contract theory says. You don't use it to improve society, you use it to sort of get back what you already had. We can see from experience that revolutions can and have improved society. We can look at the American Revolution, which, of course, not just overthrew a sovereign and got a better one in case, but we actually discovered some new concepts about what people should be doing in a society from that revolution. The French Revolution created a sort of culture of the general will and the popular desire, which has become an integral part of French society. Certainly the Russian Revolution, for even all the challenges and criticisms people can make of it, it did get Russia out of a monarchy. And social revolutions or revolutionaries, you can point to them too as creating important improvements in society. So social contract theory just says you can't use revolution for improvement. You can only use it to get back the rights you already have when someone is abusing them or not dealing with them in the way they should. And other theories of revolution, a similar sort of interaction is at play, that even people who say revolutions can improve society, there's always parts of society that they mark off, or I should say parts of the state that they mark off as being separate from revolution. There's always some part of the state that can't be changed, can't be improved, can't be gotten rid of with the revolution. And the project that I set myself in my dissertation, which I updated for the book, is what would a theory of revolution look like which can change anything? And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that we should use revolution to change everything, but I am saying that we should understand it in a way that helps it to helps us think about how revolution can be used as a tool to change any part of the state that is not working for us.
Can you, before you get into your actual theory, tell us more about change? It sounds like change is really important to what your account is of revolution. So can you tell us more about change?
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to talk about it in broad terms, then I'll try to move a little into sort of how I talk about it. Change is just something that becomes different. So if I grow taller, what I was, the height I was, is now different. I no longer have that height. Or in a government setting, a change would be, let's say, getting rid of a policy that we find to be discriminatory. The creation of hate speech laws, where we now say certain types of speech are unacceptable because we've learned that they are dangerous. That was a change. It was a change in policy and government in our society. It didn't really mess with the foundations of it. But that is what a revolution really would need to do and should do, is it should change the foundations of something. In fact, that's a term that's often used in discussions of revolution, is that revolution is about radical change. You are not just sort of changing where things are located or what people are saying in a state. You are changing something about the foundations of the state.
And that's what radical means, right? Radical means to the root. So
yes.
If you have a radical change, then you have a foundation changing the root.
Yeah, radical often is used as a synonym with extreme. And in this case, we're talking about extreme as in not small changes, but big changes. The extremeness is in the type of change that you were looking for. And I should be clear, even though there's a lot of left-wing let's say, activists who will call themselves radicals and want lots of change. You can be a radical on any side. Even you could say maybe you want to get rid of the political spectrum altogether. That would be a radical change. And that too would be sort of someone who you could call yourself a revolutionary, a radical. And actually that has been used by philosophers who you really can't fit them on this left-right political spectrum. Their theory, which is one that they explicitly call radical change, is about getting rid of this way of thinking. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but one of the things they want to get rid of is this way of thinking that says, there's a line here and everyone falls somewhere on it. So that itself is radical change. And it would be part of or can be part of an attempt to really rewrite society starting from the bottom up.
Okay, so now we understand change better.
Mm-hmm.
So can I start to invite you to give us your unique addition to this literature and these ideas about revolution?
Yes. So I keep all of that that basic idea about radical change that needs to change the foundations. To get into my own theory, there's a sort of a new idea, or new school of thought that began in mathematics. It's been continued a lot by hard sciences. In fact, I learned more about it from biologists who are using it, called systems theory. Systems can be very simple or very complex, and the study of complex systems has kind of sparked a new way of looking at systems, because you kind of need a new math to understand them. Many times to model these systems, you actually can't do it just by yourself. You need computers. So the modeling is something that we've only recently learned how to do because we have computers that can run hundreds, if not thousands, or maybe even hundreds of thousands of calculations at a time with many, many different variables. The human mind, unfortunately, we can't deal with all of that. And computers have recently become fast enough, we can start to model these things and look at the outcomes. And that's where this whole sort of idea of complex systems comes from. And what we've learned is that systems that are complex, they may look simple if you're just looking at the pieces of them, but they can become remarkably complex if you just have lots of these pieces interacting in very predictable ways at the same time. Consciousness is probably the most commonly used example of this type of thinking. We know what a neuron looks like. We know what a neuron does. We've experimented with them, studied them, going back, generations. We have lots of neurons in our brain, and they all work at the same time. Now, if you look at a neuron, just one neuron by itself, you would not be able to predict human consciousness. But when you have a lot of these things working together at the same time, consciousness arises. And there's still lots we don't understand about that, but that's where we have simplicity at the heart of the system, many different things interacting, producing something unique. This is called emergence, when a system that starts simple produces something that we didn't see or couldn't have seen just by looking at the pieces by themselves. Ecosystems also fall into this category, that we know a lot about individual species. We know what they need to survive. We know what sort of behaviors they engage in. Put them together with all these other things in an ecosystem, all of a sudden you start to get sort of unpredictable things coming out of it, or novel phenomena, that is, novel things coming out of it that you wouldn't predict. My theory of revolution draws on this to say that we should think about revolution using systems theory, that revolution is the sort of unpredictable outcome of all these different pieces of a state interacting with one another, or all these different pieces of society interacting with one another. Because our states, our societies, our our political orders, to use the definition, they're very complex. We have many people following law at the same time. We have many people who are needing things from the government at one time. And you put them all together, we may know what individual actions will look like. We may be able to predict what people will do. We're going to have a tough time seeing what's going to come from that because of the remarkable complexity our society displays. And so revolution is sort of the outcome of that. I would say it's our society trying to wrestle with and to deal with the remarkable sort of amounts of change and variability, that is the amount of different types of changes and possibilities that exist in our society. And it needs to be sort of an outcome of all of this interaction that rewrites, or at least attempts to rewrite, the foundations of our society. So let me again stop there in case you have questions about any of that.
Sure do. So I'm getting the idea from you that something about systems and math and logic is inspiring your understanding of how we should think about a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make sure I have that down correctly, but other than asking like how exactly do you make that analogy work, I'm also curious about what exactly you have in mind when you're talking about radical change in the state.
Mm-hmm.
What do you count as the root or the foundation of the state,
Mm-hmm.
or of whatever else you want to call it if not the state? So I invite you to tell us more
Yeah.
from any of those angles, please.
Let me start by going through a concept that it sounded unique or unusual to me when I first thought of it, but I ultimately make the case for it in my book, and hope people will kind of be interested in it, agree with me on it, or at least willing to engage with me on it. But I'm going to move slowly because it can sound like a very tricky concept. So part of my book and my project was to try to understand what radical change was. And so I started thinking about the concept of change. What is it? Which led me to sort of think about, okay, what is change in itself? That is, if I'm not thinking about change as something being changed, but just change itself, what can I say about it? And the conclusion I really came to was nothing. I can say nothing about change prior to having something fixed, which I can then talk about. So in order to talk about change, I need to keep one thing the same. That way I can start to talk about change in relation to this thing that is now the same. I can say something has changed in relation to this thing, or something about this thing has changed. That it used to be blue, now it's red. But at that point, I'm keeping the thing the same and just saying its color is changing. Or I can say, here's this thing, here's this other thing. Now it's closer. This thing is still staying the same, but this thing is changing in relationship to it. So radical change, or change in itself, I argue, is just basically nothing. And I also equate it with sort of completely movement. We often think about nothingness as absence, that nothingness is when you take away everything and there's nothing left. I actually say that we can understand change as sort of complete nothingness and at the same time complete movement, because if we have nothing but change, we have nothing. So change to me is equivalent to nothingness, which is also equivalent to complete absolute movement, where everything is in motion, nothing stays the same. Let me stop there just to make sure I haven't lost you.
No, I'm with you. For the change part, I'm just thinking about Kant in my head, because Kant literally says that, and I like his idea. So I like this that you're saying it, and then the Heraclitus, the everything in flux. If nothing is stable, then you don't have anything. So I'm with you. I got both of those. I'm curious where you're going.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right to bring up Kant and Heraclitus. Certainly Heraclitus, I reread him when I came to this theory just to review his insights. And of course, the Kantian a priori is informing so many of the thinkers that I used in my work.
His example is that if you had a boat, you don't know if it's moving if there's nothing against which you can compare to track the change. So exactly like you're saying, if there's no substratum or relation, then there is no change, there's no movement. So
Yeah.
Kant would agree with you. So that's a plus.
Yeah, well, that's good. What I say a state is when you start to hold something constant. And I relate it to systems theory by referring to it as sort of a function, which in mathematical terms just mean you are setting a relationship as something that's fixed. You know, a good example, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. We probably all remember that from our studies of geometry back in the day. There's the triangles with the right angles and so on. Yeah, that you can figure out the angle of the third side, a squared, b squared, c squared. That's a function. It's defining a relationship between these two sides of the triangle and the diagonal side of a triangle so that you can figure out how the length of different sides using variables that you already have. You can think about the state in similar terms, that you are starting to fix relationships when you talk about political orders and when you talk about the state. If we're using social contract theory, you are fixing a relationship between the leader and the people. It's going to be different for different contract theorists, but you're starting to say that there's a relationship between the leader and the people. The nature of that contract differs. Who's in charge will differ. If we're talking about Hobbes, the sovereign has the ability to decide everything. The people just follow. If we're talking about Locke, the sovereign has the right to enforce laws as long as they are respecting people's rights. But that's really the equivalent of a function. We just don't put it in mathematical terms. You now have relationships that are fixed, that are held constant, and we can think about that as sort of, we are now taking this background of pure change, pure movement, and holding something constant in order to start exploring different relationships with this object and the other things around it. Which is, one of the ways math starts to build outwards. As it starts to fix relationships, it can start to think about, well, if this is true, then this other thing will be true. Or if these two things are true, we can start to imagine different ways of understanding this third thing to be true. And it'll kind of go outwards and outwards until it gets into very complex things that are very difficult for me to understand. But the state and politics really works the same way, that we, again, not using mathematical terms, but we are fixing relationships. We are saying certain things are held this constant and stay the same, and we use that to build outward. So if social contract is at the foundation of our state, and in the US, a social contract is at the foundation of our state, it's the Constitution. Then we have a government that kind of moves outward. All this policy that they create, it needs to come back to this Constitution. We measure it in relationship to this Constitution. You can see it in almost every Supreme Court case where they have to decide whether something is constitutional or not. So this foundation that is sort of a relationship in our society between the executive and legislative and judicial branches and all the other things that are in the Constitution. Now we've explored outwards, and let's say we have to sort of relate it back to this foundation. That's what a political order does, and that's how it works. And in other states, the same thing will be true, just maybe a different foundation. And radical change and revolution for me is when you stop holding that foundational element or relationship constant, and you start holding another one constant. You've switched from one foundation to another. So in our society, we have certain things protected by the Constitution, by the Bill of Rights. A revolution could undo that and set up a new foundation. If we're thinking about some very radical elements of our society, and I don't mean that in a negative way or even a positive way, I'm just using it as a factual statement, they want some pretty radical changes, including, for some libertarians at least, they want to get rid of certain rights, or definitely want to get rid of certain policies. If we're talking about some of the more radical socialists out there and communists out there, they want a concept of equality more at the heart of our society and in the Constitution than what they see currently in the Bill of Rights. And we do say all men are created equal, but they would argue that the equality that we are using is basically negative equality, that people or government can't infringe on things people have, but we don't have positive equality, which is the ensuring that everyone has enough resources to get by, ensuring that everyone has a decent occupation. So it's not just that we aren't taking away equality or freedoms that people have, but we should be giving things to make sure they can act in relatively equal ways as well. And communists and some of the more radical socialists out there would say that should be a part of our foundation. We should, change the Constitution wherever it sort of has, let's say, rights to property that prevent us from being able to give relatively equal resources to everyone and spread them around in such a way that everyone can act equally, as well as being treated equally under the law.
Okay, does it have to be a radical change for it to count as revolution on your count of revolution?
It does. Now, what a foundation of a society is and how much of it needs to change, I can't say that's a question I've dealt with a lot, because I've been more interested in explaining what this change is and how it happens.
The
But
next
yeah,
question would be, like what? Or what do you have in mind? What to you is a radical enough change that it counts as a revolution?
yeah.
But let's move on from that if your focus is elsewhere, and I'll
Okay.
follow your focus. Why is it important that we stop thinking of this other kind of traditional way, and why is it important that we adopt your concept of a revolution?
If we keep certain figures or relationships in the state as the same, then there's always going to be things that we are limited from doing in our society. And that's because these relationships that we hold the same, such as the social contract in Locke and Hobbes and others, they say you can't change the social contract, you can't get rid of the sovereign. In Hobbes, you can't even have a sovereign that's not one person. If you have a sovereign that's even two people, he says it's like a mad dog, because it's going to be fighting with itself and won't follow one line of reasoning. So you're always limited, basically, from being able to do certain things in your society, and those things have been shown to do harm in our society, well, other societies as well, in practice. A very sort of uncontroversial aspect of this would be sort of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and that the change it created there. You can justify the segregation the South was undergoing using libertarianism, or using sort of Locke's form of liberalism, because they focus on negative rights. This idea of you have the right to life, liberty, and property, it can't be infringed upon. The people who set up white-only places in private property, that was, according to them and their argument, which came directly from, among other places, social contract theory, that was their right. They have the freedom to do whatever they want with their business. as a result, you can argue that it is unjust to revolt against sort of the segregationist society of the US because it's not in contradiction with the foundations of our society. But we also know the serious harm that it was doing, that one group of people was treated as second-class citizens in ways that harmed their ability to access healthcare, to get their basic needs met, and the whole slew of other problems that existed. The social contract theory then has been connected, in actually the US, but multiple places as well, to serious forms of oppression. And my project is trying to develop a theory of revolution that will say that as long as we are looking for one political order, there's always going to be types of oppression that could come out of it. And other sort of ideas about how the state and revolution work, I would argue, do the same thing. I don't want to get into great detail unless you want to go into it, but communism has a theory of revolution. It has an idea of the state as well and how it should work. And that idea, that sort of theory, developed by Marx most famously, but used by Lenin and Mao and others, was used to oppress people in Russia, Soviet Russia, and China, and I would argue is still being used to justify oppression in China.
But on your view, that can't happen because we're justified in going to the roots and starting all over.
Yes.
So that would be an advantage of your concept of revolution allows for us to say, that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but traditional accounts of revolution would not allow for us to do that.
Right. Now, I will say my theory does not prescribe what is wrong. That is, it doesn't tell you what's right and wrong, but it does allow you to make that change. You just have to find your new foundation. What I'm interested in doing is showing how that can be possible and why that can be a good thing to think on those lines. But my argument would be that you may have found a new foundation. It can still be used to oppress. So you always need to sort of be critical. At this point, I'll kind of bring it back to a more commonly known theory because I do associate my theory with this, which is anarchism. Most people don't really understand what anarchism actually says, so I was a little hesitant to make that leap, but we're going there anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. Anarchism says there is no one right order to the government. The anarchists who got the theory started used to say, we want to bring everything back to people's rational choice. Now, I don't do that because I subscribe to a sort of variation of anarchism that says you're never going to be able to make everything that happens a matter of free choice, which means that you're going to have to sort of go back and review what's happening in society on a regular basis. And if you see problems, challenge those problems, try to create better ways of doing things. We know a lot about how as beings, as biological entities, we make choices based on emotion, at least as often as we do based on reason. And there's the whole unconscious mind that affects how we think. So I don't really believe we're ever going to be able to bring everything that's happening in society back to rational choice. But I do say that there is no right form of government, that we should tailor our government to the specifics of the situation we're living in, and that we need to discuss it and be open to change and thinking about it, which is really, that is explicitly an anarchist thing. That, anarchism was never specifically associated with violence and chaos and people doing whatever they want, although the terms become associated with that, unfortunately. It was always about, let's think about what's right for us here and now and realize that what's right here and now may not be right in the future. And that's kind of the way sort of my theory works too, that we can find a good foundation and it can work, it can challenge oppression. We may need to go back, revisit, and find a different one later on. it's an ongoing process, but one that's worth doing.
Excellent. I have an excellent little book on anarchism, and I was just looking for it so I could hold it up.
Uh,
Finally, it came up. So, my last question would be this: why would any government adopt your theory if it means people are allowed to overrule them and start over?
I guess I would say I'm not really interested in governments using my theory because it wasn't really meant for them anyway. A government is always going to work with an order, and that's fine. They should. It would be difficult for them to do anything if they didn't have an order. My theory is for the people on the ground, the people who are feeling that a change needs to happen and want to understand how and why. So I explicitly don't want governments doing that, which is not to say that I won't support a government. I will always sort of think about, are they doing what's right? And if so, I'll support them. But this is really meant for, the grassroots level.